Dr. Camille Charles. Camille Zabriskie Charles is the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Term Professor in the Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology, Africana Studies, and Education at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also Director of the Center for Africana Studies and Interim Chair of the Department of Africana Studies. Her research interests are included in the areas of urban inequality, racial attitudes and intergroup relations, racial residential segregation, minorities in higher education, and racial identity. Professor Charles is the author of Won't You Be My Neighbor, Race, Class, and Residence in Los Angeles, and co-author of 2 books, The Source of the River, The Social Origins of Freshmen at America's Selective Colleges and University, and Taming the River, Negotiating the Academic, Financial, and Social Currents in Selective Colleges and Universities. Dr. Charles is a friend as well as the voice of activism for many of us who are faculty here at the University of Penn, holding Penn to accountability on these matters of race, poverty, and class. I introduce to you Dr. Charles.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I don't have to tell you who I am now, so thank you for that, Howard. It's great to be here this morning and to welcome and thank all of you for coming to Race, Poverty, and Change in America. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind all of you in our audience to please silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. We are, I think, videotaping today as well, so if you could take a moment and do that, we'd all appreciate it. It is with great pleasure that I open this 2-day symposium that commemorates the anniversaries of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the War on Poverty, and Lau v. Nichols. As director of the Center for Africana Studies here at Penn, we're proud to partner with Vivian Gadsden and the Graduate School of Education on this important symposium that captures the anniversaries of 4 social policies that speak to the issues of justice in the United States. And I think that we're commemorating those anniversaries at a very important time currently in our history. I'm very honored and pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Vivian Gadsden, whose vision and conceptualization of this 2-day symposium brings us all here today. Vivian L. Gadsden is the William T. Carter Professor of Child Development and Professor of Education here at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also an affiliated faculty member in Africana Studies and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. She is director of the National Center on Fathers and Families. Professor Gadsden's research and scholarly interests focus on children and families across the life course, from early childhood through the aging process, and particularly children and families at the greatest risk for academic and social vulnerability. She serves on several boards, including the board of the Foundation for Child Development, and as lead investigator on multiple private and government grants. Professor Gadsden has published articles and books on literacy and African American youth, reentry of incarcerated parents in the lives of children, families, and communities, and risk, equity, and schooling, as well as a forthcoming book volume on children of incarcerated parents. She is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association and co-editor-in-chief of its journal, Educational Researcher. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vivian Gadsden.
Thank you so much, Camille, and thank you, Howard, for introducing Camille. It was lovely. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us this morning. This symposium, as Dr. Charles said, commemorates the anniversaries of Brown v. Board, Civil Rights Act, War on Poverty, and Lau v. Nichols. The social policies that they invoked speak to the issue of justice in America individually and collectively. They represented the potential to reshape the experiences of millions of disenfranchised American children and families. Embedded in all was the reality that the America at the turn of the 20th century and post-World War II was destined to become a different America, one in which demographic shifts were occurring Racial discrimination and educational inequity were being challenged. Social inequality and structural hierarchies were being fiercely questioned, and the tenor of the country was changing. They provoked debates, resistance, opposition, polarization, and social conscience while confronting major barriers that reduced quality of schooling and quality of life for many Americans, disproportionately Black, Latino, and poor. In current day perspectives, the questions that advanced the agendas for these events over the past 60 years are still salient, including whether and how matters of place, race, poverty, and social change are used in current debates around persistent dilemmas about discrimination, access, and opportunity. So today we are focusing on these issues not as a retrospective account, but as an opportunity to examine the ways in which the major goals and purposes of the four events are instantiated in current day cultural experiences, educational practice, and social structures. We invite you to join us in identifying and addressing the questions and problems that serve as barriers for children and families in multiple contexts, in schools and communities and neighborhoods, children who are immigrants or are in immigrant families, children and families that are affected by poverty, hardship, joblessness, homelessness, and incarceration. And to think about where America goes from here in the face of two, from my perspective, depressing events over the past couple of weeks, and most recently, yesterday. What is the change that is sought? What actions are necessary to effect this change? With that, I want to introduce Professor Stevenson, who was up here earlier. He is the Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education, Professor of Africana Studies, and the former chair of the Applied Psychology and Human Development Division in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Stevenson was a recipient of the W.T. Grant Foundation's Faculty Scholar Award, a national research award given to only 5 researchers per year. He was a presidential fellow at the Salzburg Seminar, which is held in Salzburg, Austria. And he is the author of a recent book entitled Promoting Racial Literacy. Most importantly to me, he is an incredible colleague and friend. And you will note that both Dr. Stevenson and our guest speaker today have the same last name, which makes this an especially wonderful moment. So, thank you so much. Howard?
Thank you, Vivian. Yeah, we are brothers. Yes, we are brothers. It is an honor for me to introduce Bryan, my brother. Some info you may not have is Bryan is a 1985 graduate of Harvard with both a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government and a JD from the School of Law. He joined the clinical faculty at NYU School of Law in 1998. Since 1989, he's been the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. And you have information about that in your packet. What you don't know is that Bryan's work has garnered him national acclaim. He's been awarded the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship Award, the Reebok Human Rights Award, the ACL National Medal of Liberty, the Public Interest Lawyer of the Year by the National Association of Public Interest Lawyers, and the Award for Courageous Advocacy from the American College of Trial Lawyers and Lawyer for the People Award from the National Lawyers Guild. He's also received many honorary degrees from several universities, including Penn, Yale, Georgetown University School of Law, and Eastern University alma mater. He has published several widely disseminated manuals on capital litigation and written extensively on criminal justice, capital punishment, and civil rights issues, and has prompted, from his work, a comment from the Nobel Prize-winning South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who has called Bryan America's young Mandela. Bryan has won relief for many folks over the years, mostly known for his capital defense work, but his work has also involved litigation of prison conditions and the like. In 2012, he won a landmark Supreme Court case that barred states from giving mandatory life sentences without parole to children. His recent book, Just Mercy, focuses on several stories over his career, but particularly his battle to free Walter Johnny D. McMillan, a black man who was falsely convicted and condemned to die for killing a white woman in Harper Lee's hometown of Monroeville, Alabama. One little story I will tell you before he comes up is that at that 2012 Supreme Court case, I and my family were blessed and lucky enough to watch him litigate. And during the litigation, there was at one point some very interesting and challenging comments from Justice Scalia made at the time. And my 7-year-old son Julian, turned to me and asked me, "Daddy, is that man messing with Uncle B?" And I said, "Yes, Julian, that man is messing with Uncle B. But watch what Uncle B does next." And Bryan began to basically dismantle the arguments before him in both comical and tenacious fashion. It was a joy to behold. So I am delighted and very proud to introduce to you Bryan Stevenson.
Well, I'm extremely honored to be here this morning. It's a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to talk to you at this important gathering. Just looking at the program, I think this is an especially important time to be convening to talk about these critical issues. I'm also always delighted to be in the space with my brother, who is my soulmate in many ways. Howard and I grew up in a community that is poor, and we were marginalized by our race and economic status, and saw things and experienced things that have shaped both of us. And so when he asked me to be here, as is always my orientation, my inclination was to say yes and to try to find a way to create some time and space to be in the room with him. He is my older brother. We grew up in a family. Howard is actually 15 months older than me, and my sister, our sister, is 11 months younger than I am. So we were very close in age, but closer still in our view of things. And I wanted to spend my time with you this morning really reflecting on dynamics that I think are essential for confronting the kinds of challenges that we face in this country at this time. In my view, there is a direct line between slavery and mass incarceration. I think the dynamics and experiences of many people of color today are comparable to the challenges that we were dealing with in this country in the mid-19th century. I'm also persuaded that the solutions to these institutional threats to individual life and opportunity, to security, are going to be comparable to the kind of institutional responses that we needed to confront slavery and terrorism and segregation. And I want to talk about that because I don't think we spend enough time sometimes stepping back from the day-to-day tasks that many of us are pulled into as academics and students and researchers and lawyers and practitioners to think about perhaps the slightly bigger picture. And I'd like to, in this time, to kind of talk about that. America's a very different country today than it was 40 years ago. And if you're not kind of aware of it, you can sometimes believe that what you're seeing has been the way things have been for a really long time. But we are radically different in some very negative and destructive ways than we were 40 years ago. In 1972, we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons in this country. Today, we have 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have some 6 million people on probation and parole in this country. There are 68 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they apply for a job, for many jobs, they have to report that, and their chance of employment is dramatically undermined. There are collateral consequences to mass incarceration that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. In 10 states, you permanently lose the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction. In my state of Alabama, 34% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote. And in 4 months, everybody in Washington, everybody in government will flee to Selma, Alabama, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the March from Selma to Montgomery. We will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act when there has never been a time since the passage of the Voting Rights Act when disenfranchisement of African Americans has been higher. The projection from the Justice Department is that 1 in 3 black male babies born in the United States this century is expected to go to jail or prison at some point during his lifetime. That was not true in the 20th century, that was not true in the 19th century, that became true in the 21st century. And these challenges, these realities create horrific consequences for many poor and people of color. The incarceration of women has increased 640% in the last 20 years. We've put tens of thousands of women in prison for low-level drug crimes and nonviolent crimes, 70% of whom have children. And those children suffer dramatically, sometimes lifetime consequences as a result of that incarceration. So there is this profound difference in where we are that I believe we need to talk about through the lens of struggle, resistance, and reform. And I want to talk about that by suggesting that there are 4 dynamics that I believe are necessary to confronting the kind of threats that are posed by many of the issues that we are talking about throughout this conference, whether we're talking about difference and bias or exclusion or poverty or racial consciousness. I believe that these dynamics are essential. And the first is proximity. I do not think that we can make a difference in confronting the challenges that we face in poor communities, in communities of color, around immigration issues, around equality issues, until we appreciate the power of proximity. I don't believe you can do effective work unless you get close to the communities that you are trying to serve. I don't think you can be an effective researcher until you spend time in proximity with the subjects of your research. I don't think you can be an effective lawyer or advocate until you understand the nuances of the communities that you are trying to serve. There are things you hear when you get proximate that you cannot hear until you're proximate. There are things you see when you get proximate that you cannot see from a distance. And too much of our academic life and sometimes our institutional life is designed to keep us distant from the challenges and problems that we want to talk so much about. And I'm here to urge that is, in my judgment, a misguided way to go about problem solving. We actually have to get closer to the problems, the communities that are struggling, to the places where people are being marginalized, to the areas of our society where there is inequality and injustice. Our instinct is to go the opposite direction because we're all built and designed to go to the places where things are safe and comfortable. But I am persuaded that we actually have to do the opposite. Proximity creates understanding that you cannot achieve without it. Howard and I actually grew up in a community where black children could not go to the public schools. Our father had to leave the county. There were no high schools for black kids when it was time for him to go to high school. We lived in the community. I started my education in the colored school in Sussex County, and lawyers came into our community and opened up the public schools and made it possible for us to get to the public school. But for their willingness to get proximate to us in Sussex County, Delaware, neither of us would be on Penn's campus today doing what we are doing. I am a product of someone's choice to get proximate. And because of that choice, the public schools opened up for us, and we were able to go to college, and Howard was able to go to graduate school, and I was able to go to law school. And I'm not unaware of how that choice that some other person made to get proximate has impacted me. We grew up in a poor community. And I understand now things about that poverty that I didn't understand before. We were Some 20 years ago, talking one day, Howard and I and the Philadelphia Inquirer had actually done a series on rural poverty. And Howard and I were talking, we were looking at these photographs, and we looked at it and then we said, wait a minute, that's our neighborhood, that's where we're from. And they were talking about this section and this idea that you can grow up in a space but not have a narrative for that space was something that was deeply meaningful to us. But people came into that space and their proximity made a difference. Well, I got to go to college. I was a philosophy major, history, political science major. Howard and I both went to the same school, Eastern University, out on the main line. I had a great experience there. It was a small school, so we could play sports, we could do music. Howard and I roomed together. It was a great time for me, and I would, go to these beautiful places on campus and sit down and study and reflect, and I just thought I was having the time of my life. And then toward my senior year, somebody came up to me and they said, well, what are you going to do after you graduate from college? And it was actually a hostile question to me because I hadn't thought about what came after college. I was so deeply I thought college was going to go on forever. And I was a philosophy major, and I realized for the first time that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. So I started running around actually trying to find a way to extend my education, and I was frantically looking into graduate programs. Howard had gone to the school to a psychology program, and I looked into that. I was looking into history programs. I was looking into political science programs. But I realized something I didn't realize before, which is that if you do graduate work in history or psychology or political science, you actually have to know something about history, political science, or psychology. That was pretty intimidating to me, and that's how I found law school. Because you don't have to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up and found my way to Harvard Law School, and I'll tell you something really honestly, I was at the law school, and 3 months into it, I hated it. I went to law school because I was interested in dealing with the legacy of inequality and poverty and race and justice, and they weren't talking about race. They weren't talking about poverty. They weren't talking about justice. And I was so frustrated that I said, I don't think I'm going to do this. And I decided to finish my first year of the law school and then go to the School of Government at Harvard. And so I did. I went over to the Kennedy School and began a course of study in the public policy program. And 3 months into that, I had to sit down and realize that I actually hated that even more. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs, but it didn't seem to matter whose costs got maximized. Whose costs got minimized and whose benefits got maximized. It was apolitical. And I went back to the law school trying to reconcile myself to a life as a lawyer that I didn't think was going to be fully animated, fully plugged in. And it was during that time that I had an opportunity to work with a human rights organization in Atlanta, Georgia, headed by an amazing lawyer by the name of Steve Bright, who provided legal services to people on death row. And I went down there for a month, and I found this community of lawyers deeply engaged in providing services to condemned prisoners. And their lives seemed turned on. They seemed plugged in. And I was so excited to see this group of lawyers functioning in this way. And one of the lawyers asked me to go to death row and explain to one of the condemned men that he wasn't at risk of execution any time in the next year. And I came to the office the next day and I said, well, which lawyer is going to come with me to go to death row to explain this to this man? They said, well, we don't have time to spare a lawyer to go with you. You have to go by yourself. And all of a sudden I became very nervous. And I got in my car and I started driving down to Jackson, Georgia to speak with this man. And I was so anxious and I was just so convinced that this man was going to be disappointed at me when he met me. And I got to the prison and I had rehearsed what I was going to say to him, but I just went inside the prison and was so overwhelmed that I'd forgotten what I'd rehearsed. And I looked at these tall, dark walls and these forbidding bars and cells clanking. They put me in this little tiny visitation room, and I was sitting there waiting for this condemned man. And the more I sat, the more anxious I became. And finally, they unlocked the door, and I could hear the chains on the other side of the door, and there stood this condemned prisoner. He had handcuffs on his wrists. He had chains on his ankles. He had a chain around his waist. He was just covered with chains. And they took the chains off, and it took them almost 10 minutes to get these chains off, and I stood there watching him, and I was so anxious. And finally, they got all the chains off of this man. He walked over to me, and I went over to him, and the first thing I could do was just say, I'm so sorry. Got everything I was supposed to say. I just said, I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I can't answer any of your questions about the death penalty. I don't know much about the appeals process. I don't know much about the criminal procedures. I don't know much about the system. I don't know much about any of the things that you probably have questions about, but they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. When I said that, the man grabbed my hands and he said, wait, 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 say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And I never will forget it. He grabbed my hands and said, wait, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And at that point, this man hugged me. And he says, I want you to know you're the first person I've talked to in 2 years who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard. He said, I can't tell you what this means to me. He says, now I'm going to call my wife, I'm going to call my children. I haven't let them come to visit because I was afraid they were going to show up and I'd have an execution date. Now I'm going to see my wife, now I'm going to see my children. And he thanked me for changing the quality of his experience by just giving him those words. We sat down and had this amazing conversation. He was exactly my age, same month, same day, same year. And 15 minutes turned into an hour, and an hour turned into 2 hours, 2 hours turned into 3 hours, and even though I'd only scheduled to be there for an hour, we were talking 3 hours into this meeting. And he was asking me questions about myself, and I was asking him questions about him, and before I knew it, the time had just passed. And then the guards came in. They were angry that I'd stayed so long past my time. And they couldn't do anything to me, so they took it out on him, and they started treating him very roughly. They put the handcuffs on his wrist too tight. They threw him against the wall, and they wrapped the chain around his waist, and he was grimacing. I tried to stop them from doing what they were doing, but I couldn't. They then wrapped the chains around his ankles, and I could see him grimacing some more. And I tried to stop them, but I couldn't get them to back down. And he just kept saying to me, he said, Bryan, don't worry about this, just come back. And I watched them pushing this man roughly out of the room, and he was grimacing. And he kept saying, Bryan, don't worry about this, just come back. And then I saw them about to push him out of the room, and I watched while he planted his feet. And this last time when they tried to push him out of the room, he didn't move when they pushed him. And I never will forget him looking at me, and he looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this, just come back. And then he did something I've never forgotten. The man looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this, just come back. And then I watched him close his eyes and then throw his head back. And then he started to sing. Would have never guessed it, but he started singing in this big, beautiful, powerful voice, and he started singing the words of this hymn I hadn't heard in a while. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. The guards stopped moving. Nobody did anything. And then they started pushing him down the hallway, and you could hear these chains clanging, but you could also hear this condemned man singing about higher ground. And I will tell you that it was proximity to a condemned man singing about higher ground that changed my interest in the study of law. All of a sudden, I believed that I was supposed to help condemned people get to higher ground. There was something in the man's voice, his humanity, his compassion, his dignity that allowed me to recognize things I could not have recognized from a distance. I went back to Harvard Law School, and you couldn't get me out of the law library because I needed to understand everything about criminal procedure, about appellate procedure, about constitutional law, about the way in which litigation functions, about federalism. It changed my orientation. And I'm an advocate of the proposition that when you get proximate, you learn things that will empower, inspire, and energize whatever it is you're trying to do to make a difference. If we have a mandate to think differently about how to disrupt poverty in the lives of people who've been generationally poor, if we have a mandate to confront racial inequality and injustice, if we have a mandate to do something about the narratives that have condemned so many people, my prescription is that we've got to get closer to those communities, those people, those problems, because proximity is essential. Well, the second thing I'm persuaded is that not only do we have to be proximate, but we also have to change narratives. It's worth understanding that there are narratives that defend and sustain all of the problems that we are trying to confront. There are narratives out there. It's not just that we've had these incidents over the last 2 weeks involving police misconduct and these lethal encounters, but there are narratives out there that are actually allowing these grand jurors to feel like they're making appropriate decisions. There are narratives out there about people's worth and value, and if we don't understand the narrative and make it part of our challenge to change the narrative, I think we will fail. It's not enough to have good ideas. It's not enough to have a good paper. It's not enough to have a good strategy. It's not enough to have some understanding of what things should be. I think we have to have an understanding of the narrative and change the narrative. A narrative has emerged around children in this country that's a very different narrative in the last 40, 50 years. There were criminologists, there were people actually at Penn and other institutions around this country that 30 years ago were going around saying that some children aren't really children. They came up with a narrative about some kids, and they used some faulty data to make these projections, and they said that these children may look like kids, they may sound like kids, and they were mostly talking about black and brown boys. They said, but they're not really kids. That these children may present that way, they may act that way at times, but don't be fooled, these children aren't children. They came up with a new word, John DeIlio and James Fox and Charles Fox and these others. They said, these children aren't children, they're, quote, super predators. And that word became a defining narrative for every state in this country, because it was after that narrative that every state lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. We began criminalizing and demonizing children and putting them in adult jails and prisons, and today we have some 250,000 people serving long prison sentences for crimes they committed when they were children. Today, we have some 10,000 children in adult jails and prisons where they face elevated risks of sexual assault and suicide. Today, we have some 3,000 children that have been condemned to die in prison, some as young as 13 and 14 years of age. And you want to know the state with the highest number of children sentenced to die in prison? That would be Pennsylvania. I've represented 13 and 14-year-old children in this state condemned to die in prison. And the narratives that we've told have been narratives that have evolved and shifted and begun to compromise even our educational policy. Now we suspend and expel and disrupt and all of these things. One of the greatest challenges that we face in the education sector is how to confront these metrics that have emerged about successful schools. We grade them and we want them to race to the top, and we reward these schools when they have certain kinds of scores, but we don't look at the suspension and expulsion rates in those schools. In my view, you are never a successful school. You are not a top school if you have high rates of suspension and expulsion. You are failing the children in that community. You don't get judged by the kids that make it all the way through. You've got to be judged by all the kids that walk through the door. And until we change that narrative, I am persuaded we are going to be pursuing policies that do not succeed in confronting the legacies of poverty and racial and discrimination. My clients have gotten younger and younger and younger. I got involved in a case many years ago involving a child who was living in a house where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. And this boy's mother had a boyfriend, and the man would sometimes get drunk and violent. And he'd come home and he'd do something that would create some dysfunction. And one day the man had been drinking, and he came into the house, and he called the boy's mother into the kitchen, and she walked in there, and the man didn't say anything. He just punched her in the face. She fell on the floor unconscious and was bleeding, and the little child ran into the kitchen to try to revive his mom. He saw his mom on the floor covered with blood, and after 20 minutes, he couldn't get her to wake up. He couldn't get her to move. And so this little boy got up, and he walked into the bedroom where the man had gone inside and fallen asleep. And the boy went over to a dresser drawer, and he pulled out the handgun that he knew that this man kept in the dresser drawer, and he walked over to where the man was sleeping, and he stood there pointing the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, this little child tragically pulled the trigger. He shot the man in the head. The man died instantly. Now, this boy was 5 feet tall. He was under 100 pounds. He'd not had any prior juvenile adjudications. He was actually a pretty good student. He was the kind of kid who probably would have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. And his grandmother called me to get involved in the case, and he'd been there 3 nights, and I went to the jail, and I started having this interview with this child, and we had a very difficult interview. He wasn't answering any of my questions. And no matter what I asked him, he just sat there staring. And at some point I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You gotta talk to me. Wouldn't say a word. And so I got up and I walked around the table and I pulled my chair close to where he was sitting. I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You gotta talk to me. Wouldn't say a word. And at some point I didn't know what to do, so I just started leaning on him. I don't even know why. But there was a point at which I leaned on him where I felt him lean back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him and I said, come on, you gotta talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And at this point, this little boy started crying, and he fell into my arms and cried hysterically for almost an hour. And through his tears, he began talking to me not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night he had been hurt by several men. He told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. He told me on the next night he'd been hurt by so many people he couldn't remember how many there had been. And while I held that little boy while he was crying hysterically, I could not make sense of this. And I left the jail and I thought to myself, who is responsible for this? And I realized that we are. We've allowed a narrative to emerge about some of our children that have allowed us to do incredibly cruel things. We've been silent and indifferent and distant. We got that little boy out of there, and I'm happy to report some wonderful people got involved in his life, and that's been a good thing. But today, again, 10,000 children are in precisely that situation. We have too many children in this country, too many children in this city who are born into violent families. They live in violent neighborhoods. They go to violent schools. They are chased by violent gangs. They are demonized by violent people. And at some point, they react violently. And that tends to be the moment when we try to do something. And what we do is we crush them. And these narratives of violence and trauma need to be addressed if we're going to make a difference in the lives of some of our poorest and most vulnerable children. You cannot create interventions for these communities without understanding these narratives. Well, I'm equally persuaded that we've got to change the narrative of race in America. In many ways, while we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, while we're celebrating the Civil Rights Act, while we're celebrating all of these things, I believe that we have lost the narrative war. And by that I mean we have not confronted in an honest and truthful way the legacy of racial inequality in this country. We've been silent, and we've allowed this kind of instinct for celebration to overwhelm our instinct for truth-telling. And because of that, we are suffering. Don't be confused. These incidents in New York and in Ferguson, Missouri are a function of our failure to win the narrative war. And so I believe we've got to actually start talking about this history in a different way. At EJI, we have a whole project on race and poverty, and what we are actually doing is talking about slavery. Because I don't think we can actually get to the place we want to get to in the narrative discussion that we need to have until we start with these institutions that have shaped the lives of people of color. And the truth of it is that slavery is an institution that still shadows and haunts and undermines us, because America wasn't just a country that had people who were enslaved. There were lots of countries that had slavery. People say, oh, they had slaves in Africa. They did. They had slavery in Europe. They did. But those were societies with slavery. We were something different. We were something else. America became not a society with slavery. We became a slave society. We actually created an ideology, a mythology, to legitimate the institution of slavery. Our slavery wasn't about the conditions of unfortunate people who had, for a period of time, had to do the kind of indentured servitude that we associate with slavery. Our slavery was about race and racial difference. We created a narrative that said that people of African descent are inferior. They're not as smart, they're not as hardworking, they're not as capable, and these differences actually made slavery legitimate. We defended the institution of slavery by pointing to these permanent hereditary characteristics of people of African descent. And this myth about racial difference wasn't addressed by the 13th Amendment. It was not addressed by the Emancipation Proclamation. We talk about those issues, we talk about those instances in American history, but neither of those things dealt with the myths. And because of that, slavery didn't end, it evolved. It turned into something else. Because we never told the truth about racial difference at the end of the Civil War, we then entered another era between Reconstruction and World War II, which I define as the era of terrorism. African Americans between Reconstruction and World War II were terrorized. They were controlled through violence and intimidation and terror. Our next report is actually about lynchings. We're going to document some 4,000 lynchings that took place in 12 states. And there's something about lynching that most people don't know. Most lynchings, many lynchings, were what we call public spectacle lynchings, where the entire community came and celebrated the barbarous, brutal execution of a black person. They were racial terror. Older people of color come up to me sometimes. They say, Mr. Stevenson, I get so angry when I see somebody or hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They say, Mr. Stevenson, we grew up with terrorism. We lived on the other side of the railroad tracks because we had to organize ourselves, segregate ourselves for security. And they'll say, Mr. Stevenson, make them stop saying that because it hurts us when we hear that. And they have every right to be angry about that. And that terrorism that we talk about, the lynching experience, the convicted leasing experience, a lot of times, people in Philadelphia and northern communities think I'm just talking about something in the South, but the truth of it is that most African Americans are in the communities where they are today. Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago. My grandmother came from Bowling Green, Virginia to Philadelphia to flee terror. These communities were inhabited not by African Americans seeking economic opportunity. Black people left the Deep South and went to Oakland and Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Detroit in these communities not as people seeking economic opportunity, but as refugees from terror. They are exiles. They are internally displaced people. And when you know something about the needs of refugees and people trauma affected by violence and threat, you know something that we haven't done in these communities. In Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, Chicago, Detroit, we didn't accept people of color coming from these places where they'd been terrorized as people who had special needs. We actually tolerated them. We thought we were doing something kind and good because we simply let them come and we didn't subject them to the kind of terrorism and violence they were experiencing in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. And we actually felt good about ourselves because we did that. And that mindset, that narrative has continued to define every policy that has continued since then. And so now, when we have a need in these communities, well, we will certainly feel comfortable moving these refugees, these exiles, these people who've flown for terror, who we've been so kind to tolerate, to some other part of the city when we have another need. And we move people around and we displace them and we undermine their opportunity to be connected in the city, and we police them and we patrol them and we in some other ways terrorize them because we've never really accepted that status. And so we've got to talk about the legacy of terror and what it means to be a refugee, an exile, a trauma-induced person who's fled into the communities that we now occupy. Well, not only that, we followed the era of lynching and terrorism from World War II into the modern era with the civil rights movement. And one of the great frustrations that I have is that even there, we haven't, in my judgment, told the truth about the challenges of what decades of humiliation and segregation have done, not just to people of color, but to everybody. My parents were humiliated on a regular basis. Howard and I would go with our mother or our father into the town, and we had to worry about what kind of experience they might be forced to endure. And it created anxiety for us. And that anxiety kind of manifests itself in ways that we are still coping with. You have a generation of people in this country whose humiliation and injury cannot be addressed until we talk about it. And rather than committing ourselves to a process of truth and reconciliation at the end of the civil rights era in the 1960s after the passage of these laws, we did the opposite. We tried to move on without talking about all of the damage that had been done. And I will tell you that what we now know about that is that you cannot succeed until you tell the truth. In South Africa, there had to be a process of truth and reconciliation following apartheid. In Rwanda, there has been a recognition that there has to be truth and reconciliation to recover from genocide. We have to commit ourselves to a process of truth and reconciliation. And frankly, I believe we're actually undermining that truth and reconciliation need by being so celebratory about all of these events. I'll be honest, I don't really like it. 50th anniversary, 60th anniversary, everybody gets to celebrate, and there are no qualifications. You can show up at the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and even be hostile to voting rights for people of color. It's this kind of crazy thing. Everybody gets to celebrate. We don't ask any questions. We don't ask what you think. We don't ask where you're from. You just show up and celebrate. And even the civil rights movement's been reduced almost as if it was this 3-day event. I hear people talking about it. It was like on day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on the bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we signed all of these laws. And if we think about our history like that, of course we're going to be frustrated that people are still talking about racial inequality. But the truth is that for decades, we injured people. We harmed people, we humiliated people, we marginalized people, we subordinated people, and that cannot be addressed in a simple celebration. We've got to commit ourselves to the truth of what we've done, because there are now presumptions of guilt and dangerousness that follow people of color. You know, these incidents in New York and Ferguson are mostly about the presumption of danger and guilt that all black people are born with in this country. And you may think that you can buy your way out of it. You may think you can educate yourself out of it. But the truth is that it's always there. And it only takes one moment for it to manifest itself. You know, ask Dr. Gates at Harvard. Ask 100 other people. And I will tell you also that this presumption of guilt and dangerousness is exhausting. It's burdensome. It's frustrating. You know, I looked at that video involving this young man who was killed by the police in New York. And there was a lot of conversation about it yesterday. And people are focusing on the chokehold and all the lethal interaction between those police officers and that young man. And I agree with all of the commentary that it is outrageous that he will not be held accountable. You know, that the grand jury doesn't make a decision of whether you're guilty or innocent. The grand jury is only making a decision whether there is a basis for there to be a trial. And that they could not find misconduct, even a misdemeanor, is pretty shocking, but it responds to this idea that for many people, young men of color can only be offenders. They cannot be victims. When you're presumed dangerous and guilty, we can't see your victimization. We can only see the way in which you have offended. And we've got to change that narrative. And I will tell you, those of you who think that you are beyond it, that it doesn't take long for it to manifest itself. I've been practicing law for a long time. And I've been on the street in Atlanta, Georgia, and had police officers confront me and pull a gun and point it at my head and say, move, and I'll blow your head off. This book I've written, Just Mercy, I talk a lot about that because I don't want anyone confused about this presumption. I was in a court not too long ago. I was sitting at defense counsel's table getting ready to do a hearing. It was the first time I'd been in court. Had my suit on. I think I had this suit. I don't have that many, so I think it was probably this one. I was sitting at counsel's table waiting for the hearing to start, and the judge walked out, and the judge saw me sitting there. And the judge looked at me and he said, hey, you get out of my courtroom. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. You wait until your lawyer gets here before you come into my courtroom. I stood up and I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing. And the prosecutor started laughing. And I made myself laugh too because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. And my client came in, a young white kid who I was representing. We did the hearing, but afterward I was thinking to myself, this is the judge with tremendous power and discretion to condemn lives, to shape lives, to make sentencing decisions, and he is unquestionably undermined by a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. And we've got to change that narrative. We are actually trying to put monuments and markers at slave trading places all across this country. They've done some work in Philadelphia, which I'm very encouraged by, but we need to do a whole lot more. We want to put markers and monuments at every lynching site in America. I don't think you should be able to go past a place where an African American was lynched in an act of racial terror without being forced to reflect on that moment. If you go to Germany now, you are forced to confront the legacy of the Holocaust. I think it's an incredibly important thing. There's an effort there to monumentalize and memorialize the spaces where people were abducted and sent to concentration camps. And that difficult legacy is nonetheless a legacy you're forced to confront and think about because people rightly have concluded that it's only through reflection that we commit ourselves to the kind of conduct and relationships and policymaking that minimize the threats. We've done the opposite here. And so we need to elevate the spaces where this legacy of terror has persisted. Changing the narrative, I am persuaded, is essential. Third thing, I should have warned you, these get harder as I go along, but third thing, I am persuaded that we actually have to be hopeful, that you cannot actually make a difference in the lives of poor and minority communities. You cannot disrupt the presumption of guilt and dangerousness. You cannot change the narrative. You cannot affect many of the policies that are creating so much inequality and marginalization until you find your hope. Because I don't believe you can actually achieve these things with hopelessness. In fact, I believe that injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And actually in academia, it's actually very hard to be hopeful. Many of you are the most vulnerable when it comes to becoming hopeless. Because you understand the complexity of the problems. You spend most of your time dissecting and deconstructing the complexities that create and define the problems, and you keep finding new problems that surround these sorts of issues. And when you're only thinking about these problems, it's easy to persuade yourself, gosh, this is a problem too big. Can't do anything about this. But I'm persuaded that when you get there, you become part of the problem rather than the solution. Because every effort to deconstruct slavery and terror and segregation has required a community of people who were hopeful about what they could do, people who were willing to believe things they haven't seen. And I actually think it starts with individual hope. I'm persuaded of that. Václav Havel, the great Czech leader, talked about this. Havel said in Eastern Europe during the time of Soviet domination, they wanted all kinds of things. They wanted recognition from governments. They wanted money and resources, but the only thing they needed was hope. A willingness to believe that they could be free, that they could create the kind of community where people could have healthy, human, whole relationships. And I am persuaded of that. Now, I'd like to think that you get to the point where you've been doing good work for a long enough period of time that you don't have to worry about this hope thing anymore. But the truth of it is, it doesn't work like that. I've been representing people on death row for over 30 years, and I came from a community where there was a great deal of despair and hopelessness, and yet I've seen some opportunities for me and obviously for Howard and all of us, but the truth of it is I still got to work on my hope dynamic. Because I'm still often tempted to be hopeless about what we can achieve. When I go back to Alabama, we've got 9 people facing execution dates. We've got all of these young people who we won this case at the United States Supreme Court, banning these mandatory death in prison sentences, and I was so excited for the 500 children in the state of Pennsylvania who were condemned to die in prison. Again, some of them 13 and 14 years of age. And then we had to confront a state government, your attorney general, those of you who are residents here, who said, no, I want to block that decision from being implemented. And he persuaded the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to hold that the 500 people serving these life without parole sentences here don't get the benefit of this new rule. And so none of them have gotten relief yet. And it can make you hopeless seeing all this. And so you've got to work on your hope dynamic. And I'll be honest, the thing that makes me more hopeless, that threatens me, burdens me more than anything, is our silence about this legacy of racial inequality. The way we tolerate things. You know, I get mad when I hear people talking about the good old days of the early 20th century, the grand days of the 19th century. I live in a state, Alabama, where we romanticize the era of slavery. We celebrate those who organized to defend slavery. Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday in Alabama. Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. It's not Dr. King Day in Alabama, it's Dr. King / Robert E. Lee Day. And it provokes me. I cannot tell you how angry I get. I'll be honest, Howard and I grew up in Sussex County. And because of its proximity to the north, it was one of these places that's a southern community that was desperate to retain its southern identity. So we couldn't go 300 yards in any direction without having to see somebody's Confederate flag. And I'll be honest, when I see these flags, I get angry. They make me, they frustrate me. They challenge me. I was going to a prison not too long ago, and there was a truck outside the prison. And this truck was like a shrine to the Old South. It had the gun rack, and it had all of these Confederate flag decals, and it had bumper stickers all over the truck. There was a bumper sticker on this truck I'd actually never seen before. This bumper sticker read, quote, "If I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own cotton." Hadn't seen that one before. And I looked at this truck, and I was so antagonized. And I said, well, I'm going to go see my client. I went into the prison, and there was a guard standing at the door, a white guard. And I said, hi, I'm here for a legal visit. And the guard said to me, you're not a lawyer. I said, no, sir, I am a lawyer. He said, well, where's your bar card? I said, well, my bar card is in the car, but I've never had to show my bar card before. He said, you're coming into my prison, I need to see your bar card. And he made me go back to my car to get the bar card to show him I was a lawyer. So I did, and I came back, and I was a little indignant about it. I said, I want to see my client now. He said, well, you're going to have to get in the bathroom. I'm going to give you a strip search before I let you in. I said, no, sir, lawyers don't get strip searched to come into this prison. Couldn't get anybody to help me. And so I had to go into the bathroom. He said, if you're coming into my prison, you're going to get in that bathroom. And so I did, and I subjected myself to this humiliating search. I came back out, was trying to recover some dignity. I said, look, I want to see my client now. He said, you got to go back there and sign the book. I said, lawyers don't have to sign that book. You're coming into my prison, you go back there and sign the book. So I did. Finally, he led me over to the door, and he unlocked the door, and I was about to go inside, and he grabbed me by the arm, and he said, hey, wait, let me ask you something. I said, what's that? He said, did you see that truck out there with those bumper stickers and flags? I said, yeah, I saw that truck. He said, I want you to know that that's my truck. Really angry guy, nasty guy. I was really upset by it. And I went into the prison to wait for my client to come out. It was a client I'd never met before, and I knew he was disabled, but that's all I knew about him. And this man came out and he sat down, and the first thing he said to me was, quote, "Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake?" And I looked at, and I thought to myself, this is the strangest day I've had in a really long time. I said, no, I didn't bring you a chocolate milkshake. I'm your lawyer. I'm here to represent you. And I started asking my questions, but he wasn't paying any attention. And I realized he was hung up on this milkshake. And I said, look, man, I'm sorry. I didn't know you wanted me to bring you a chocolate milkshake. The next time I come, if they let me, I'll bring you a chocolate milkshake. And he smiled and smiled and smiled. A very disabled person, very disabled. Incredible abuse, incredible neglect. He was in the foster care system. He was actually in 29 foster homes by the time he was 10 years old. His foster parents at the age of 11 took him out into the woods, tied him to a tree, and left him there. Found by hunters 2 days later. At the age of 13, he was showing signs of schizophrenia. At the age of 15, he had developed a crack cocaine addiction. At the age of 16, he was a heroin addict. At the age of 18, he was homeless, beginning to have psychotic episodes, and in the midst of a psychotic episode, at the age of 19, he committed a horrific, brutal crime. The man was charged with murder for this crime he committed and actually convicted and sentenced to death. When I got the record, I looked at the record, and there was at no point during the trial that anyone mentioned the word mental health, mental illness, mental disability. Terrible representation. Not unique, because in this country we have a big problem when it comes to the poor getting the legal assistance that they need. I'm persuaded that in America we treat people better if they're rich and guilty than if they're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And we started working on this case to try to present the evidence of the man's disabilities and his mental health problems to get the court to reevaluate his conviction and sentence. And every time I saw this client, I had to explain to him that they wouldn't let me bring him a chocolate milkshake before I could even get him to pay attention. Well, finally, after several months of preparation, it was time to go to court, and we had our experts lined up. We had some really good evidence to present about his mental status. We had him evaluated, and our experts were prepared to testify. And when I got to the courthouse, I saw this guard, who I hadn't seen since that ugly day, that the guard had been the guard that had brought him from the prison to the courthouse. I went to the client, we went through our little ritual about the milkshake, and he was fine. And we started presenting our evidence, and after 3 days of evidence, we rested our case, and I felt good about the case because our experts had done well. The witnesses had documented this man's disabilities and struggles. And about a month later, it was time to go see the man back at the prison. And when I got to the prison, after these hearings, a month later, I was walking inside, and I saw this truck again. And when I saw the truck, I almost decided to just come back another day. But when I was a little boy, the civil rights people used to sing this song, "I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." And I started hearing that song and realized I couldn't just go away. So I said, no, I'm gonna go deal with this guy. And I walked past the truck and I went to the front door of the prison, and sure enough, there was the guard. And I went up to him and I said, "Hi, I'm here for a legal visit." He said, "Hello, Mr. Stevenson, how are you?" Kind of threw me. I said, "I'm fine." I said, "I've got my bar card." He said, "I don't need to see that." I said, "Okay, well, I'll go in the bathroom for your search." He said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, we don't need to do that." I said, "Okay, well, let me go over here and sign the book." He said, "Mr. Stevenson, I saw you coming, and I signed you in." Completely threw me. I said, "Well, thank you. I guess I'll go see my client." He said, "Yes, sir." And he took me over to the door, and I watched this officer try to unlock the padlock that led into the visitation area, and his hand started to shake. And I was watching him try to get the key in, and he couldn't do it. And finally, he was getting more and more emotional, and eventually he got the key in the lock. He unlocked the door. And he opened the door, but he looked up to me, and I could tell he was really emotional. He said, "Mr. Stevenson, can I say something to you?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, I just want you to know I was in that courtroom listening." And he says, "I want you to know that I think what you're doing is a good thing." He says, "I came up in the foster care system too." He said, "I didn't think anybody had it as bad as I did, but I realized that maybe your client had it worse than I did. And I just want you to know I think what you're doing is a good thing. You keep doing the thing you're doing." Would have never, ever guessed it. Never. And then he said, "I want to shake your hand." And I said to him, I said, "Mister, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your saying that. It means the world to me." He said, "No, sir. I just think what you're doing is a good thing." I was about to go inside to see my client. He grabbed me by the arm and said, wait, I got to tell you something else." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, I just want you to know I did something on the way back from the courthouse to the prison." I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "Well, on the way back, I took an exit, and I took your client to a Wendy's and I bought him a chocolate milkshake. Now, I know it's a really silly story, but it speaks to me about the need for us to be hopeful about the people and things that we need to confront. For me, that's a challenge for that kind of person. For others, it's going to be a challenge when they look at some of our children who are struggling, whose behaviors reflect a life of trauma and violence, and they say there's nothing we can do. I want us to be hopeful enough to say that is not true. That is not true. There are actually interventions for kids and people suffering from trauma that are incredibly effective. And when we understand what they are and what we know what they mean and require, we can make a difference in the lives of our most vulnerable people. But we have got to have the hope necessary to see past the ugliness, the behavioral problems, the manifestation of all of the dysfunction that's created so much of our inequality. Fourth and finally, this is the last one. I believe we have to choose to do uncomfortable things. And this is the toughest one. But the truth of it is that we cannot actually make a difference. We cannot challenge this poverty and inequality and all these narratives unless we choose to do uncomfortable things. And I know that's hard. Human beings are actually built to do the thing that is comfortable. We are instinctively programmed to go to the spaces where we're most comfortable. We all want to live in comfortable neighborhoods. We all want to go to the spaces where we feel comfortable. Even when we come into a room like this, we look for the people we know so we can sit where we are comfortable. And I'm not against comfort. Don't get me wrong. I'm all about comfort. I like comfort, right? I'm not saying, I gave a talk down in Mississippi and I got off the plane and people came up to me and they said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, the conference is being held at the DoubleTree. But we've been reading about you and we know all about you and we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the DoubleTree. So we asked the farmer if he would put you up at the barn and I said, what is wrong with you? I said, I like the chocolate chip cookie just like everybody else. Put me at the DoubleTree. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about choosing to do uncomfortable things when it's necessary. The civil rights movement was managed. It was populated by people who chose to do uncomfortable. You think it's comfortable to let somebody spit on you and call you all of these names? People used to think all those civil rights people were weak. I'm strong. I'm not going to take that. You know, it's the opposite. The strength of character. Do an uncomfortable thing. You think it's comfortable? I don't like it. If I had to pick the place that I'm going to be most comfortable, it would not be Montgomery, Alabama. I'm going to tell you. With all of that landscape and all of these things, but sometimes you have to choose to do uncomfortable things. You've got to go toward the problem when everybody else is running away from it. You've got to go to the sections of this city where there is strife and conflict and violence and despair. You've got to go to the schools where the performance metrics are low. You've got to go to the people whose lives have been disrupted by trauma and violence and dysfunction and disability. And choosing to do uncomfortable things requires an orientation, a philosophy, a belief system, because otherwise you won't do it. And the truth of it is that there are very few institutions, places, people, or times when you will be required to do it, which is why I say you have to choose to do uncomfortable things. Now, again, I wish I got to the point where I didn't have to worry about this anymore, but the truth is I have to keep doing it too. And it's hard. It's challenging. We represent people on death row. We have had a lot of executions in Alabama. Between 2009 and 2011, Alabama had the highest execution rate in America. Some 17 executions in a 30-month time period. Every other month, somebody was being executed. And my staff and I made the decision that we were going to represent every condemned person with an execution date if they didn't have a lawyer. And we jumped into these cases, and each time the courts would say no, and these people would be executed, and it was just devastating to the people on my staff. And after 5 or 6, I said, you know what, you all take a break. I'm going to do the next couple. I felt like I've been doing this a while. I can handle it. I can manage it. And I got involved in a case involving a man who was facing execution who was intellectually disabled. He had mental retardation. And the Supreme Court has banned the execution of people with mental retardation, but we have a system that is so focused on finality that we actually make finality more of a priority than fairness. And every court we presented this evidence about his intellectual disability said, oh, this is too late. You should have done that long ago. And because a man couldn't get a lawyer, he could not get a lawyer. There is no right to counsel for condemned people in this country. After you've been convicted and sentenced to death, the government, the state, does not require that a lawyer be appointed to you. And right now we have dozens of people literally dying for legal assistance in this country. And we kept trying to save this man, kept trying. I went to every court and everybody said, too late, too late, too late. And finally the Supreme Court denied our last stay motion. And I was on the phone talking to this man shortly before the execution, and I was just struggling. Because in addition to his intellectual disability, this man also had a very severe speech impediment. And the closer we got to the execution time, the harder it was for him to get his words out. And the man was just trying to thank me for fighting for him, but he couldn't speak. And you could hear the guards in the background, and the time was approaching, and I was watching the clock, and I was listening to this man just really struggle to get his words out, and he couldn't get the words out. And the more he tried to talk, the more he broke my heart. I was just standing there, and the tears were running down my face, and I'd actually remembered something I'd forgotten until I was talking to the man that night. When I was a little boy, Howard and I used to go to this little tiny country church down in Georgetown, Delaware, and one day my mom was there, and we were there talking to some friends of ours. And I remembered something I had forgotten all about, and we were talking to our friends, and we were just talking. There was a little skinny kid who I'd never seen before. He'd come to church with one of our friends. And this little boy was just standing there, and he wasn't saying anything. And at some point, I asked him a question. And this little boy tried to answer my question, but he couldn't get his words out because he also had a very severe speech impediment. And when he tried to get his words out and he couldn't, I did something really ignorant because I'd never met anybody with that challenge. And when he tried to talk and he couldn't, and he couldn't get his words out, I laughed. And my mom was standing across the room. My mother saw me laughing at this boy, and my mom gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she called me over to her and she said, "Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that." And I tried to defend myself. I said, "Mom, I'm sorry, I didn't know any better." And she said, No, Bryan, you know much better than that." And I never will forget it. She said, "Now I want you to go back over there and tell that little boy you're sorry." I said, "Okay, Mom." And then she grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait. After you tell him you're sorry, she said, "I want you to hug that little boy." And then she said, "After you hug him," she said, "I want you to tell him that you love him." I said, "Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy." And then she looked at me, she said, "No," and she gave me that look again. So I said, "Okay." And I went over there, and I remember going over to this little boy and saying, "Look, man, I'm sorry." And then I sort of lunged at him and gave him my little boy version of a man hug. And what I'd forgotten until the night of this execution was, then I remembered saying to this little boy, as insincerely as I possibly could, I remembered saying to him, "And I love you." And what I'd forgotten was how when I said that, that little boy hugged me back and whispered in my ear flawlessly, he said, "I love you too." I was on the phone listening to this man talk, trying to get his words out and just being overwhelmed with his challenges. And finally he did get the words out. He said, "I want to thank you for representing me." He said, "I want to thank you for fighting for me." And then he said, "I love you for trying to save my life." And when he hung up the phone, I just said, "I can't do this anymore. It's too hard." I was struck by how broken he is. And I started asking these questions I didn't have answers to. Why do we want to kill all the broken people in this country? Why do we want to do that? Why is it when we see brokenness, we want to crush it, we want to deny it compassion and humanity? We do the opposite of what we should be doing. And I just thought, you know what, it's too much. Broken. I realized that my life is filled with brokenness. All of my clients are broken. Broken by poverty, broken by disability, broken by racism, broken by despair, broken by misery, broken by marginalization, broken. I work in a broken system of justice. Judges and prosecutors broken by their cynicism and their hopelessness and their exclusion and their distance. Broken. I realized I don't want to do this no more. And that's when you have to have that conversation with yourself where you ask yourself why you're doing it. I said, "Bryan, well, if you're not going to do it anymore, you need to reflect on why you've been doing it." And then I realized something I hadn't realized. And I realized that I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. For the first time I realized I don't do what I do because I get paid to do it. I don't get much money. I realized I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I don't do what I do because it's important. I don't do what I do because there are issues at stake, because I care about people. I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I realized something that night I had not realized before. And I realized that night that I don't do what I do for any of those reasons. I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth of it is that when you get close to inequality and suffering and misery and marginalization, it will break you. You pick up little cuts and scrapes and bruises and things that you don't get from a distance. But in brokenness, there is something about recognizing your humanity. You don't have to be an African American to be mourning this morning about what happened in New York last night. You don't have to be poor and black to need to mourn for the families of all of these young people who are being victimized and traumatized and presumed guilty and dangerous and bad outcomes. When you are broken, you recognize that you are human. And in brokenness, I realize I am not trying to save the lives of condemned people on death row. I am not trying to create lives for broken children. And I am trying to save myself. Because when they are executed, I feel that. You know, I've learned really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I believe that for every human being. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And because of that, there is this human dignity that must be respected by law. And when we disrespect it in anyone, we disrespect it in everyone. I'm also persuaded that as we talk about poverty over the next couple of days, I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. We have an arrogance in this country. We tend to think that we can throw pennies and quarters at various problems, and we make ourselves feel better about our charity and generosity. But I am persuaded that in America and in Philadelphia and communities across this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we commit ourselves to just relationships with all people, when we think about what justice requires based on what we have done with our history of racial inequality and exclusion, then and only then can we actually get to the place where we can deal with poverty. And finally, I believe that we have to judge ourselves, our commitment to education, our commitment to the rule of law, our prosperity, our character, our civility, not by how we treat the powerful and the rich and the privileged. You judge a society, a community, and its character and its commitments, not by how it treats the powerful and the rich and the privileged, but by how it treats the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And it's in that nexus that I do believe that we have an important work to be done. And you're going to hear some amazing presenters over the next couple of days who are going to give you lots of information that I think we need. We need to be strategic, we need to be informed, we need to be tactical, and I want us all to have great ideas in our mind at the end of this symposium about what we're going to do, but I also want all of us to allow those ideas in our mind to be fueled by some conviction in our heart, to be willing to believe things we haven't seen about what we can do in this community. I'll end with this. Sometimes I think it's tempting to believe that we can make a difference comfortably and conveniently without appreciating what is required from every individual who stands up for human rights. And I do think that in many ways it is personal, right? Sometimes some of you will have to be the person who stands when everybody else is sitting. Some of you are going to have to be the person who speaks when everybody else is quiet. But I believe that in that moment, in that act, in that witness, even though it may be breaking in a little ways, there is great power, enormous power. I was giving a talk not too long ago, and I was in a church in rural Alabama. There was an older man in a wheelchair sitting in the back of the church. And he came into the church and he just started staring at me during my talk. And he actually had this very stern look on his face. And I thought he was angry, and it was kind of distracting because I just couldn't tell what was going on. But I got through my talk, and after I finished the talk, people came up. They were very nice. They were very polite. But the man in the back kept staring at me from this wheelchair. And finally, when everybody else left, he had this little boy wheel him up to me. And this man came up to me with this very, very kind of aggressive and stern look on his face. And as he came up to me, he got right in front of me, and he said to me, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stood back. I didn't know how to respond. And he asked me again. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I started mumbling something. I don't even know what I said. And he says, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And I stood there looking at him. And then this man said to me, he says, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And then he said, "You're beating the drum for justice." And I never will forget how moved I felt by that. And he said to me, "You're beating the drum for justice." He said, "You keep beating the drum for justice." And then he said, "Come here, come here, come here." And he grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. And he said, "I'm going to show you something." And he turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have behind my right ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." And then he turned his head. He said, "You see this mark down here at the bottom of my neck?" He said, "I got that mark. I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi during Freedom Summer." And then he turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot right here? He said, that's my bruise. I got that bruise during the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama." And then he looked at me. He says, "People think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And the legacy that we have to reflect on is the legacy of struggle. It is the legacy of people who choose to get proximate to problems. It is the legacy of people who are struggling to change narratives. It is the legacy of people who were hopeful when it didn't make sense to be hopeful. And it is the legacy of people who have done uncomfortable things. And if we are serious about confronting these issues, creating greater opportunity and eliminating disparities, dealing with urban poverty, dealing with racism, dealing with this line between slavery and mass incarceration, I believe we have to embrace that legacy. I'm very, very privileged and very, very honored that you invited me to have this time with you this morning, and I wish all of you the very best throughout the course of this symposium and in all of the work you're doing. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions and answers, so folks can come to the mic. That would be great.
Yes. I'd like to ask you a question about, first of all, you're a brilliant orator. God bless you. I'm Morris Wolf. At one time, I was assistant to Robert F. Kennedy in 1964 in helping to draft Title II and 7 of the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
I think the fact that you emphasize hope is so vital, because in those days we sang together, "We Shall Overcome." And it was through that mystical time of goodwill when Mickey Schwerter and Goodman died in Mississippi and were buried beneath the dam. So I think as great as your talk is, and I take nothing from it, we also have to remember that 4 innocent rabbis got shot last week while praying in Jerusalem. So this idea that no man is an island, every man and woman is part of the main, is vital. I was also a public defender trying to help people on death row. But I wonder if you'd at least comment about this, because it has been a joint movement. We are all good people at heart. Not everybody. I'll take that back immediately. I have a 15-minute rule. Anything stupid I say, I can retreat. No. I wonder if you'd comment on the fact that it's going to take everyone and the fact of hope and deal with anger. Anger is evil and it discombobulates us. How do we deal with anger?
Sure. No, I think your point's well taken. I think that, yeah, there is a global context, but I actually think that there are unique challenges in confronting the issues of racial inequality in this country, because we've actually gotten very comfortable with a narrative that says to us we don't have to talk about these issues. That the suffering and struggles of the poorest people in these communities don't really reflect on this history. And so I think we have a unique challenge that's going to require a unique kind of intervention. It doesn't in any way detract from the global character of these issues, because I think you're right. And if anything, we have a lot to learn from how other communities have tried to deal with these narrative issues in other contexts. Yes, I do think that hope is key to it, because you know, a lot of what you see in education policy, when I go into the classroom and I see a hopeless teacher standing up in front of, or I talk to hopeless principals, I am very, very worried about that school system. I can tell you what kind of outcome to expect when you go into a courtroom if you have a hopeless judge sitting on the bench with a hopeless prosecutor and a hopeless defense lawyer. You're going to get a very bad outcome. And so I do think that that is an essential feature of confronting these issues. I think on the anger question, I don't know that, you know, I don't think we can do anything about the fact that when you are injured, when you're threatened, when you're treated unfairly, that you're going to be angry. I think what we learned during the civil rights era is that you've got to turn that anger into a kind of activism that empowers you. You know, anger can either distract you and frustrate you and actually make you more vulnerable, or it can actually empower you and energize you. I am angry about what I see on a daily basis, and I am angry about the silence of so many in our community. I am angry about the way our legal system has corrupted its commitment to protect the most vulnerable and the disfavored. I'm angry about all of those things, but I know that my anger is not the issue. Until I turn that anger into a strategy, or to a process, or to a mechanism, to a movement that allows me to do something about that, I'm only self-serving, which is why we have a tendency, and this is true in a lot of academic circles, where everybody wants to put on a kind of a radical shirt. They want to walk around in their radical shirt and be seen by other people, and they like it when people say, oh, you're a radical. But there's nothing radical about putting on a shirt. And there's certainly nothing radical about walking around an Ivy League campus with that shirt on. We've got to understand what radicalism represents. We've got to understand it's not uncomfortable, really, to put on these kinds of expressions in some of these environments. What's uncomfortable is actually going into communities where people have been terrorized by the police day in and day out, menaced by law enforcement for decades, and figure out how we are going to both confront the presumption of guilt and dangerousness in these law enforcement departments and also give young people of color the strategies for survival, because that's the priority. And so I think those kinds of reactions are partly what are going to make it possible for us to do better. But I have no doubt that this is an effort that's going to require all of us. And even in the South, I say to people, I feel we have a generation of white people in the South who were actually taught and raised and taught that they were better than other people because of their skin color. And it's a terrible thing to do to somebody, to actually give them that lie. And we haven't helped them recover from that by being silent about all of the damages that sort of trauma creates. And so I absolutely believe that we need to engage all Americans into seeing this. This problem can't be solved by a handful of people in a small space. We're going to have to get every part of our government, including law enforcement. If I were police chief, I'd be immediately calling up people like my brother and Philip Goff and Jennifer Eberhardt and a whole host of people and saying, how do I get my police department to stop presuming the guilt and dangerousness of young black men? Teach me this history so that I can teach it to my officers so that we're not acting in an unconsciously biased way. That would be my mandate, and that's part of what we also have to achieve.
Do you condone the burning of property?
I don't condone the burning of property, but it's not the first thing that I want to complain about. It's not at the top of the list of things that I want to give voice to being a problem. I absolutely do not think that resolves anything. I really don't. But I'm got a long list, including how prosecutors are presenting these cases to grand juries that I want to talk about before I get to that stuff. Yes, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Stevenson, my name is Stephen McAllister. I'm a businessman and a friend of the program, and also went to the University of Delaware, so I know what you're talking about.
Excellent.
Georgetown.
Yes.
The technical questions and things you mentioned, I do appreciate, but I want to get into something that I can use and support. And you mentioned the slavery monument project. How can I support that? Give me some information specifically on that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. So if you go to our website, which is eji.org, you'll find a bunch of materials. And I invite everybody in the room, since you're here and this is part of you, we have a couple of tools we've been using to advance this. One of them is a calendar, which is actually a racial history calendar, and you're all invited to get a calendar for free, F-R-E-E, free. If you email our office, we will send that to you. And what it does is it kind of begins to create a narrative of this history that's consistent with the way I was talking about it today. We have a report on slavery that we use as the basis for the monuments and markers that we've established. And then you'll read in the report about what we did. We actually put up markers in downtown Montgomery. If you'd come to Montgomery a year ago, there were 59 markers and monuments all about the Confederacy, not a word about slavery. And so last December, we put up markers at the river. My office is on Commerce Street. And 150 yards to the east is the river where tens of thousands of enslaved people were brought by boat and rail. Right. And the place where our office is was a former slave warehouse. And 150 yards to the west is a circle, which was the slave auction trading site. And what we've done is actually name these places with histories about each of them. Right. And these markers and monuments are reported on in our report, and we're now trying to replicate that in communities across the country. So you're more than welcome to get a copy of the report, and we'll have information in there about that. The lynching report, which is forthcoming, will be out at the end of December. We're going to identify every African-American lynched in America between 1880 and 1945. We're going to identify the county and the city where they took place. We're going to rank counties by rate of lynching, so that you'll know the counties in each of these states that had the highest rates of lynching. And the reason why we're doing that is because many of these counties also now have the highest rates of death sentencing. They have the highest rates of disparities based on race. They're the counties where people of color do not get representation. They're the places where you see police shootings of young African Americans at the highest levels. So all of that stuff is available to you if you come to our website, and we'd be happy to send it to you.
And what's that again?
EJI.org.
Okay, thank you.
You're-
We're going to actually make sure that's available through the website that you registered through. So we'll get all that information directly.
Great, terrific. Hi,
Hello, my name is Doris Thomas. I'm a Villanova and Cheney University alum.
Cheney,
And
yes.
I wanted to know about, you didn't mention Wall Street, how Wall Street was starting in New York. The whole premise behind Wall Street and how it's attached to slavery.
Yeah,
Black Friday. That also needs to come up, and because
Sure.
of the Ferguson and Eric Garner, and no indictments on the cops,
Sure.
how we need to show support, solidarity, and unity for boycotting the economic system, and showing some support for families as well as for black-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses who weren't benefiting, like during this Christmas time. Most people, run out and buy all their gifts and so forth. So I think that needs to be
sure.
discussed as well as part of the discourse,
Sure.
the public discourse. That is a $1 trillion industry. So
Yeah.
there needs to be some changes that need to be made by not just us. I'm speaking about black
Right.
people in general.
Sure.
But we have $1 trillion that we have power over collectively, and we need to be utilizing that and how to find some good attorneys who are supporting economic justice
Yeah.
when we have discrimination cases and
Yeah. No, I absolutely think that for me the model is to kind of have this approach to understanding history, so that it's not just Wall Street and these other in every community there is a narrative about how these structures have been sustained. And each of us in these communities need to understand that narrative, give voice to it, and then develop the strategies that allow us to create change. And they're different from one place to the other. There'll be some places where you're going to be able to make the kind of coalitions and form the kind of alliances that will allow some things to happen that you can't do in other places. But I think that's the approach, and I don't think that there are any things that are off the list in terms of what we have to talk about and what we need to talk about. And I absolutely agree that we need more people who are prepared, and this is where it gets challenging, and we're in an academic setting. I mean, you do have to prepare yourself for this. We need people who actually understand economics fully and completely, who are thinking about these issues. We need people who understand the sociology of land use and development. We need people who understand all of that to do the effective work that needs to be done. And so I absolutely agree that we've all got an opportunity to make a difference by expressing these issues in ways that are meaningful and appropriate for the communities that we live in. And it's not a here thing or there thing, it's an everywhere thing. And I absolutely agree with that, yeah. We got a long line right behind us.
Could we just also, if you have a question, we appreciate a question, we just want to get everybody in. If you could make it short and brief so other people can speak. Thank you.
First off, Mr. Stevenson, thank you so much. That was a phenomenally powerful talk.
Thank you.
My name is Leo Levy. I'm a junior at Science Leadership Academy, which is a local high school. I had a question about something that you said. You say that you're uncomfortable with our habit of celebrating so readily. Would you not say that there is power in celebrating our victories as a source of hope?
Yeah, I absolutely think we should celebrate our victories. I just don't think we can claim victory for voting when the United States Supreme Court 2 years ago has actually undermined the Voting Rights Act in ways that are devastating, when most states are actually now finding new ways to actually create barriers to voting, the same states that block voting all of that time. And so what I'm interested in doing is complicating the celebration. I'm not opposed to us remembering and reflecting, but what I'd be doing on the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act is actually making sure that there is no African American over the age of 18 in this country who is not registered to vote. And I'd use every penny, every dollar, every resource, every hour available to me to accomplish that. And then I'd be talking about reforms, right? Because at no point did any of these states ever support Voting Rights Act. Really, Alabama never said we want black people to vote. And that's why I think I want to change the narrative. I don't understand why we're not talking about how in some of our states They ought to be sending limousines to the home of every African American, driving them to the polls. I actually think in some of these places, black people ought to be able to vote 2 or 3 times, just because that legacy is so violent and so obstructive. But we're doing the opposite. If I had a little bit more time and I was feeling a little bit more frisky, I would tell you, you can see I'm hesitating. I don't know where to. Well, let me tell you a quick story, very quick story. In 1965, the Selma to Montgomery March, which everybody's going to celebrate, the first march was obviously called Bloody Sunday, because when John Lewis and the marchers gathered at the Edmonds-Pettus Bridge in Selma, they were beaten by police and those who were resisting, who were insulted at the idea that black people would try to get the right to vote, violently beaten and turned around. And so the call went out to have another march. And so the march that we are celebrating is actually the gathering of all these people, black and white, Jewish and Christian, from all over the country who came to Selma to stand with these marchers. Well, a college in Montgomery, Huntington College, was an all-white school, and the president of that college said, I don't want any of our students to go to the march. And in fact, you'll be suspended and expelled if you go to the march. And this very unlikely student, a young white woman, who was the homecoming queen, decided she was going to go to the march. And she went to the march with her friend and successfully participated in the march, but unfortunately was photographed by a photographer, and the photographer put the picture in a paper in the Midwest, which unfortunately was where a Huntington alum lived. He got the photograph, sent it to the school, and the school decided that they were going to expel this student. But because she was so popular, they wanted a student involved in the process of her expulsion. So they got a young man who was very aggressive and felt very strongly about these issues of segregation. He said, no, I will absolutely lead the charge to get this young woman expelled, and he did. And he successfully prosecuted this young woman, and she was kicked out of school. She never got her degree from Huntington. Now that young man was so proud of what he achieved through that expulsion that he put it in his admission essay when he applied to college, went to the University of Alabama. And he graduated from college, and he says, I'm going to be a lawyer since I'm so good at this prosecution thing. And he talked about his successful prosecution of this person in his law school admission essay. And then he graduated from law school. And when he graduated from law school, he says, well, now that I have my law degree, maybe I should just become a prosecutor. So he did. And then he became a U.S. attorney in Mobile, Alabama. And what did he do during the course of his career? He began prosecuting African Americans for violations of the Voting Rights Act. And he was known as a terror for going after black people who voted. And so effective was he that he actually intimidated people of color from voting in dozens of counties. And he was so effective that he was actually drawn to the attention of President Reagan, who then named him to be the U.S. attorney for the Southern District. And he continued on his campaign, and then he was nominated by President Bush to be a federal judge. Now, the challenge with these federal prosecutions of voting rights is that he actually worked with Justice Department lawyers all the time. And so some of these Justice Department lawyers were uneasy because he was always using the N-word to describe the people he was prosecuting. And he was nasty, and he was difficult, and he was racist. And so when he got nominated for a judge, some of these Justice Department lawyers came to his confirmation hearings and said, well, we kind of have some concerns. He uses the N-word, he does all this stuff. And because of their intervention, he was denied confirmation as a federal judge. Then a few years later, he decided, well, I think I'm going to run for the United States Senate. Didn't have much of a chance. And he was trailing in the polls until the New York Times did an expose where they talked about his failed effort to be confirmed by the Senate Judiciary Committee because of his prosecution of African Americans. And when the New York Times did that expose, people in Alabama read it, and he jumped up 20 points in the poll. And then he got elected to the United States Senate. And 3 weeks ago, as a result of the elections, this person who has this history became the new chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'm talking about Jeff Sessions. And he will decide who becomes federal judges in this country for the next 2 years, or until there's a change in the political disposition of the country. So when I'm saying about not celebrating, that's what I'm talking about, is giving voice to those histories and understanding what those histories represent. And he's the senator from my state. But I'm not interested in seeing him celebrating the Voting Rights Act, given this context, given this. And so I think we've got to complicate it in that way. Yes, we do have to give voice to when we make progress, but we have to give even bigger voice to when we have failed and make sure people understand that difference. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor Stevens, I wonder if you agree, if you see it the way I see it. I see addressing criminal justice side by side with social justice, actually defeating the purpose of both. Not to mention, when we say social justice in America, we need to study the history of the Anglo-American thing, you know what I mean? In order to understand what social justice is, because there is social justice. Back in the days, we have the white people, until this day in the dictionary, we have the term white trash. In order for the white people to uplift their poor, they went tough on them. They start calling them white trash. They have program for them. Sure. They brought them from England to America. And if you study the history of those people who discriminate against you, those lynchers, those Ku Klux Klan, at certain time, those people were called white trash. And yeah. So the question still is, addressing criminal justice side by side with social justice defeats the purpose of both.
Yeah. Well, I do think you're right that there is a broader narrative about who gets criminalized that has a lot to do with economic status, who has to do with who's kind of welcome and who's safe in the society, and we need to be very, very mindful of that. The war on drugs was a war that was actually aimed at kind of control. We've seen a lot of people who are poor and white also be sent to jails and prisons as a result of that. And so I absolutely agree that this narrative is big and broad, right? We have lots of people. So we've got, new immigrant communities. Right now, we're criminalizing people who are undocumented, right? Private prisons, which have benefited so much from this kind of mass incarceration, the link between criminal justice and social justice there, Well, it may be important for the health of the system for some. It is not important for the health of the system for everybody else. That is, when I am criminalized because my drug dependency and drug use is treated as a crime problem rather than a health problem, it does not benefit the health of the people who are committed to a just place. Right? You can look at Portugal, which deals with drug addiction as a health issue, and America that deals with drug addiction as a crime issue. And what you will see is a legacy of dysfunction and despair and poverty resulting from dealing with it as crime versus health. And so I want to change that, right? I want to change that. We spent $6 billion on jails and prisons in 1980. We spent $80 billion last year. If we cut the prison population in half, which we could do without in any way disrupting public safety, what could we do with $40 billion to help poor and minority communities in this country? $40 billion. We spend, in some states, $60,000 a year to keep somebody in prison for 20 years. $60,000 a year for writing a bad check for $100. And so what I want to do is to kind of change that, right? And I think if you say to a teacher, you've got $10,000 per student, they can do some amazing radical things. And so in that respect, I do think we have to see a broader vision, social vision, for how we want to deal with the problems of crime and criminal justice, et cetera. The criminal justice system operates in a broader context, and it's that broader context that I think I'm interested in disrupting. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi, Mr. Stevenson. Thank you for speaking today. My name is Paige McEwen. I'm a graduate student here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm actually Dr. Stevenson's student right now in the Counseling and Mental Health program.
Oh, then your question better be very good.
And I'm actually the counselor intern for Science Leadership Academy, where all these amazing students are from today.
Excellent.
I was very struck by a lot of things that you said. I grew up in the South. I went to college in North Carolina. My family is actually from Ferguson. So just a lot going on and a wonderful, wonderful speech. What I really wanted to touch on was how salient I found your 4 main points in conjunction with mental health as well as with changing the race narrative. We must be willing to get proximate. We must be willing to change the narrative. We must be willing to have hope, and we must be willing to do uncomfortable things. So those were just really fantastic points, and I was wondering, and I think you do, and I'm so glad that you brought mental health to light with your experience in the justice system. So I was just wanting to ask if you thought those 4 main points
Sure.
were as applicable to mental health.
Oh, absolutely. In this book I've written, there's a whole chapter about the intersection between mental health policy and the criminal justice system. About half of the people in jails and prisons have mental health disabilities. About 20% have severe mental health disabilities. And in the book I write about what's happened in this country with deinstitutionalization in the first half of the 20th century. And what it meant is that we had a lot of people with mental illness and disability who are poor with no place to go.
Yeah.
And in an era of over-incarceration, what that means is that they get arrested, they get sent to jails and prisons, which are ill-equipped to manage those disabilities. And if you were close to that community, like many jailers and wardens, if you had a room full of prison wardens or sheriffs who ran jails, that'd be the first thing they'd want to talk about.
Right.
Because they are proximate, and they know that this narrative about this person being dangerous is not correct. This person is disabled. Mm-hmm. And we've got to see that as disability. And so I absolutely think that it definitely is consistent with what we're talking about. And our hopefulness is that, the encouraging thing is that we can treat many of these disabilities. We're not treating them. We're aggravating them by putting people in conditions of confinement that make them worse, but we can treat them. We have a generation of children that have been traumatized. The only good thing that we can say about this is that there are interventions for dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder that are effective. Yeah. And if we started orienting ourselves to that, we could be hopeful, but it does mean doing some uncomfortable things. It does mean kind of stepping back from this narrative, bad, evil, worthless child, a worthless person, evil, bad, and being informed by what we now know about mental illness and disability, and replacing those words with words that are more descriptive that we can then do something about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tara Bell, and I'm a junior at Science Leadership Academy. One of the things is, like, you talk about, like, race and whatnot. Like, growing up, I've been raised, I've been in a school where majority of the kids were African American, mm-hmm. and like observing the behaviors and everything else, like I've been ashamed to like be in my skin because the way society treats African Americans and the way that my school is. But then when I come to SLA, I'm like more aware of like why people act like this, and like I just don't look at them from this perspective of the way you act, but I'm looking at it by a perspective like of your backstory, what happened in your life. Yeah. And so like now, like when I talk about it with my parents and my other family, when kids are like tried as adults and other things, they say that they deserve it, but do they really deserve it? Do you see what's happening in their lives? You're just judging them based on what you see, and like, do you think that this perspective will ever change? Is there still hope for other people?
Well, I so appreciate your question. It's a really, really thoughtful question, and you're doing really well to recognize these dynamics and the way they manifest themselves, and the ability to kind of evaluate things the way you just did is what I think gives me hope, because I absolutely believe that we can contextualize the behaviors of people. We can tell their stories. You know, what I do, Mark Bookman was here as a lawyer. Oh, there's Mark. Mark runs a program here that provides legal services to people who are facing the death penalty. And much of our work is actually about giving people a perspective on the life story, on the story behind the crime. And when you hear that story, you think differently about that person's worth and value. You think differently about what's an appropriate punishment. And the same can be said for every human being. And so I am hopeful if we insist on making sure that people don't make judgments until they know the full story. And that's a difficult thing. Our media frequently make the judgments without the story. We reduce people to their worst act, and then we label them. Philadelphia Inquirer said, well, rapist did this, killer did that, gang leader did that. When affluent people are charged with the same crimes, they get a job description. Firefighter accused of sexual assault. Principal accused of rape. School teacher accused of murder, right? They get an identity which matches their job type. And that kind of labeling is part of the ways in which we're not giving the full story for some people. So I think we have to insist on that. We have to recognize it when we see it, and we just have to kind of push back against it. Yes, I am hopeful because I've actually seen things change. We won these cases at the United States Supreme Court by educating the court about the ways in which this myth of super predators is a lie. And even this court, which is a very conservative court, said, you know what, you're right. And they've now banned these kinds of punishments. That's what gives me hope, that when we tell the story, we can make a difference. And so I believe part of it is just turning people's mind on, like your mind, and making them give voice to their parents and to their friends about the context of people's lives so that they don't have that instinct to say, well, they just deserve whatever they get, right? But I am hopeful about that because I see it now manifesting itself in ways that are very, very encouraging.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you for coming.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for being such a dynamic speaker that you gave that young lady the courage to come up here and talk about her hurt. The system and God make it easy for you and know the best is yet to come, sister. Brother, I just want to ask you something. I'm a reinvented guy. I'm an electrician. It took me 30, 40 years to get there. But I'm ex-offender, too. And when you talk about mass incarceration, first I want to say thank you for exposing the fact that Pennsylvania is fighting against them juvenile lifers getting out. Where all over the country they're getting out. Second, I paid for your book. I hope you'll sign it.
Yes, sir, I will do that. Absolutely.
Listen, give me a moment to talk to you. Because I just left those juveniles you're talking about.
Yeah.
In a place called Pine Grove.
Yeah.
And I was their consulary, so to speak.
Yeah.
I can't spell cat, but I write a good writ.
Yeah. Yeah.
I got a lawsuit in here I've been wanting to give to somebody.
Sure.
It's in the senator's package, but I see you at the book signing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely. No, and let me just say, I appreciate your witness. Right, we have 6 million people on probation and parole. There are millions of people who are formerly incarcerated. And you know, you're here, you're obviously articulate and thoughtful and doing good work. And I think it takes, some people don't like to talk about the fact that they're formerly incarcerated, but I actually think we need to give voice to what we have done to a generation of people and see people who are successful. And some people think, well, you commit a crime, you can't ever do anything good. You're a living witness that that's a lie. So I appreciate your giving voice to that. Be happy to sign your book, and I'll give you a card so we can exchange about the suit.
Thank you, Kyle.
All right. Thank you very much.
We'd like to just say that was a wonderful presentation, Bryan, and to thank you. I was sitting over there thinking that how inspiring it was. And as you well know, academics live a certain kind of privileged life. It's not financially privileged, but it's privileged in so many other ways. So every 10 years or so, we get the opportunity to, do these commemoratives, right? But the work is not there. It's just a kind of reminder of what has happened. And hopefully, it will motivate us to continue to fight for justice and to try to make a difference. Even as academics, I have a core of people here today, both my colleagues here at Penn and many people who are here from around the country whom I begged, cajoled, and who were kind enough to show up here today, including you. So let us be inspired to work harder, to think about the ways in which we can, as I said before, make a difference and become more knowledgeable in the ways that are available to us about the issues that Bryan described in his talk. We will make the resources at the Equal Justice Initiative available through the website. If you registered, you can just go back to that website in a couple of days. And if you haven't, you'll probably be able to be directed if you go to the Penn website. Then I also want to do the one thing before I leave. Science Leadership Academy is here today, and it's definitely one of the finest, if not the finest school in the city of Philadelphia. We had a son who went to school there, and I can tell you that it is a great place, and we are very honored to have you here. Both because you are clearly interested and you have a terrific teacher, but also because the struggle does continue, and we hope that you will take it up. So we want to thank you for being here for this part of it. We are going to take a break. Bryan has some books out, and he will sign them. We will reconvene at 12:15 with a panel on history and historiography of change, and I think it's like a brilliant follow-up panel to your talk, and we will continue through the evening. So thanks again. Let's come back to this room at 12:15. Thank you.